Okay, the time is 7 o'clock-ish, so President Paul, over to you.
Great, thanks very much, Paul. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to 2024. I still don't think it's too late to wish everybody a happy new year. As we enter into one of the most cold periods we've experienced in a long time, and I sit here in Oshawa at a balmy -11, I feel like I'm in the heat zone. It's going to be an exciting year. We start off our speaker series tonight. Dr. Duncan McDowell has put together an incredible line of speakers for this year. We're looking forward to very much to having you continue to join us on these regular meetings. Of course, next month we will be celebrating Heritage Month. We have a special event with the Heritage Foundation at City Hall and Memorial Hall on Sunday, February the 18th. Hoping a lot of people can join us. We will be also having a lovely presentation of the Kingston Historical Society Award. And Jennifer McKendry, who I see is on with us tonight, welcome, Jennifer, will be our guest speaker. The board met last week and received a report with regards to the Murney Tower, and there's a lot going to happen this year at the Murney Tower. We are entering into very close to our 100th year of operation. There will be special plans and events coming up in that year. Simgay, our curator, has put together a small committee to work through those events and how we communicate out to everybody. So a great year, I hope. Looking forward to the AGM as well. And I don't really want to take too much more of your time. Look forward to meeting some of you in person someday. Still doing hybrid, but I think it does certainly, I look at the number of people who are on in the hybrid, that just speaks to the fact that some people are still continuing to be more comfortable in this format. It is a new way of doing life in our world, and I think it is an excellent way of doing things. So with that, I will turn it back to the room, and I think it's probably Duncan who's going to come forward and introduce our speaker. Take care, all.
I'm Duncan McDowell, and welcome to the first of our lectures in the 2024 series. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Gordon Dueck from Queens. In 1974, another Queens historian, Sidney Wise, gave a talk to the Kingston Historical Association entitled A Personal View of Kingston, a view of his years spent in Kingston. And in it, he presented a very interesting theory about what makes Kingston tick. He argued that Kingston is not really a homogeneous community, but more a cluster of semi-autonomous communities within its borders. And he pointed to how distinctive some of these were. There's the Kingston establishment, the so-called Old Stones of Kingston, the Loyalist tradition. There's also the university community as a cluster. There's the military cluster around RMC and the military base. There's the civil service base around government employees and, of course, the prison system. And he argued that you could best understand Kingston in terms of the relationship of these clusters, which intersected at times, but often independently existed. Now, I think it's a very useful way of looking at Kingston. But 50 years on, we would have to remark that he forgot certain things. He overlooked certain things, much as the general history of Kingston has overlooked certain things. There were other groupings in the city that didn't really surface historiographically. Francophones, Jews, working class Kingstonians. And these communities, I think we've come to recognize as being important to our history. And tonight we're going to talk about the Black community in Kingston, who have not much surfaced in our understanding of Kingston. Yes, there was Alfie Pierce at Queens, etc., but that was more anecdotal than real history. So to tell us about this, Professor Gordon Dueck has come. Gordon is a PhD from Queens, but has other degrees from Dalhousie and the University of Manitoba, Winnipeg. He teaches Jewish history at Queens since the 1980s, thanks to Professor Jared Kolchinsky. The Holocaust has been taught at Queens, and that is a torch that Gordon has taken up, not just in the global sense, but also in the sense of Jews of Kingston. He's now moved on to look at another one of these once visible communities, the Black community in Kingston. So we welcome him here tonight to report on what he has discovered 100 years ago of the Black citizens of Kingston.
So I'll explain the title. It's called Black. It's called Barbers and Blackface.
That's it.
With a question, because not every musician, we'll be talking about 4 musicians, not every musician who was Black in the 19th century and early 20th century wore blackface. Sometimes they did because it was the unwritten rule from the 1830s to about 1900, where everyone participated in blackface minstrelsy, which is what we're going to be talking about. Blackface was just how you did it. But by 1900, there were musicians who were participating in this tradition who refused to put blackface on. And they aimed for a more authentic representation of Black music and culture than heretofore had been represented on stage. We're going to be starting with a man who came here to Kingston around 1870s, and we'll move forward. And as we go through each person's biography, we will hit the 20th century and the beginning of well, we had I don't know if you knew this, but we had a theater district here. But now what we have now is the screening room downtown. Between 1907 and 1910, in addition to the Grand Opera, the theater, there were 5, 6 Nickelodeons, or as they were called here, theatoriums, and Black musicians of Kingston who had previously worked without these theaters now became part of the theater scene. The first singer in the first Nickelodeon 5-cent theater was a Black man. The first orchestra. Initially, they didn't have orchestras in these theaters. They had a piano player and a singer. And then they had a drummer. And they would have a violinist. And eventually it would work up to an orchestra. The first orchestra to play in a movie theater in Kingston occurred in 1909. And again, it was led by an African Canadian who was born and raised here in Kingston and was a barber. I don't have pictures of all these guys. I have a picture of some other performers, and I have a picture of one of these men's sister. I'll show you the pictures as we go along. So I don't know for sure whether they were blackface. That's why it's a question mark. But I do know that these men were every bit as integral to the culture of the city as any white musician who was here at the time. Oscar Tubby. In fact, someone played with Oscar Tubby, just have never been mentioned. So we're going to look at, as I said, 4 men. And we'll do this in chronological order. Daniel Riley was born in Northern Ireland to an Irish man and a West Indian mother. He died in 1898, Kingston, Ontario. Can you hear me? He died in 1898 in Kingston, Ontario. Fred Crosby, who was a Crosby when he was barbering, and a Crosby when he was playing music, in part, I think, to make his name. He wasn't Irish. He has a very interesting past. I will know when we get to him. But he was born and bred in Kingston, and he didn't go very far from Kingston during his career. All the others had played around the world, including New York and London, England. But Crosby stayed around Kingston in the environment, in the environs here. I don't know when he died. Clarence Jones was born in 1864 in Montreal. His father had been an American Negro who was a train porter, had gone to Montreal. This is quite typical. I think Oscar Peterson's father had the same background. And when he got to Montreal, he took up barbering and trained his sons. And they had, when they moved to Kingston, a barber shop at the corner of Clarence. That's Clarence and King. George Hammond was born in Cuba, according to the 1916 census in Edmonton. He eventually moved to Edmonton from here around 1912 and died in 1917. But between 1902 and 1911, he was one of the most important men in show business in this town. But this is an obituary that I found by accident. There was no rhyme or reason to this. It's just one of those things that happens when you spend way too much time scouring newspapers and suddenly hit something by accident. Can you hear me now? So I'm just going to read you this obituary. It says here that after an illness of several weeks' duration, young Riley, a well-known violinist, died yesterday at the Hotel Dieu, aged 7. Deceased was born in Glen, County Antrim, Ireland, where he received his education. At the age of 6 years, having a talent for music, he was placed under the tuition of the best violinist in Ireland, a man named John Ellis. How did he get here? Well, 3 years before setting sail for America, he taught school under the auspices of the National Board in County Tyrone, Ireland, on the estate of the then Marquis of Marcus of Abercorn. His father had come here already. He'd settled in Illinois. So Daniel, I don't know exactly what year, but you're going to get a sense of it sort of around the time that he came here to North America. He followed his father, went to New York, and then took a boat from New York along the Avery Canal, headed to Illinois. While proceeding up the canal, he was accused by the captain of being a runaway slave. Having always been a free man, he resented the charge. Hot words ensued, and a fight was the result. Captain received a severe beating at the hands of Riley. However, before the affair ended, Daniel was tossed into the canal by some of the hands on deck. For this offense, beating the captain, a warrant was issued for his arrest, and he had to make his escape to Canada. He boarded a boat as a fugitive slave, and as such was conveyed to Toronto. He stopped 6 years in the Queen City. While in Toronto, he entered the normal school and succeeded in getting a second-class certificate. He also taught a music school there, both vocal and instrumental. And among other things that he did there was he was the musical director of the Royal Lyceum Theatre. And then he became the musical director for one of Canada's most famous Blackface comedians from Toronto, Cool Burgess. He was so cool at the time, that Professor John Watson would throw in references to him during his lectures. Because, professors are always the same. They're always trying to get hip with the kids, right? Oh, that's what happens. And interesting enough, he traveled with school Burgess throughout North America. And he came to Kingston here 2 or 3 times, and that's, I think, how he got to know this place. Before he moved here permanently, though, after he stopped touring, he went to Quebec City in 1860, played a command performance for the Prince of Wales, who was here in Queen Victoria's stead because she didn't want to make the trip. And now there's a lot to be said about that trip. For now, I'm just going to keep it there. This man, who was just a decade previously, I would say after 1850, that was the Fugitive Slave Act. That's when that was passed. Went from almost being shipped down the Mississippi River to playing a command performance for the future Canadians. And you can see on the right-hand side the advertisement. Kingston Wig gives you the address of his school. Has opened Daniel Riley, this is December 10th, 1879, has opened a school for the proper education of pupils on the violin. His textbooks will include gems from the great masters, Paganini, Old Bull, Ernst Campagnolo, Spohr, and giving the touch and style peculiar to each class of music. Riley and Me's Quadrille Orchestra is open for engagements upon reasonable terms. Apply at Riley's Barbershop, Princess Street, Kingston, April 19th or April 9th, 1880. This school, this violin conservatory was also the barbershop and a secondhand store. But it's at 49 Princess Street. That part of Princess Street eventually became known as Secondhand Row, and it's mostly Jews who had secondhand stores there. But these guys was there before. When I say these guys, I mean Daniel Riley and his stepson Arthur Fields, also a man of color. While I was researching these musicians, and I said I need more information. All I'm finding are these obituaries. Where's the other information? So I went and looked at this. This is a book, The Monarchs of Minstrelsy, that was published in New York City in 1911. And by 1911, all these men that I want to talk about had already made their mark. So I went looking for them. They're not mentioned. But neither. It's not because they're Canadian, because at least 3 of them have played me. It's not because they're Canadian.
This friend of mine.
It's because they're black. It turns out the literature of the day, the literature of Blackface, etc. So were they on the stage in the States. But remember, Daniel Riley, who almost was sent down the river, played with a white man, Cool Burgess, in Toronto, and then he played here in Kingston with white men. So we may not have been entirely tolerant of minorities here, and we weren't. It was a tough road to hoe, but he was very good. He played for the King of England. He was respected as a musician, and we stop it. And you know, in his obituary, it's mentioned that his band, his quadrille band, was the most sought after in the town. So when the kids wanted to do something hip, they would see Daniel Riley. So I went looking through for him in this book because I thought someone who's played in New York, someone who's played for the Prince of Wales, should rate a mention. It's in his obituary. It also mentions that he played with a band called the Dick Sands Minstrel Band. That was also a white band, and they're in this book, and other Canadians as well, including Kingstonians. On the left-hand side, top left-hand corner, is Billy Lyons, Kingston's first professional driver. female impersonators. This is Lou Benedict. Lou Benedict was one of the most famous blackface minstrels of his day as well. If you can't read it, I'll read it for you. Lou Benedict. The name of Lou Benedict is one of the most prominent in minstrelsy. As an end man, as a comedian and stump speaker, a satirical politician in blackface, he excelled, but he was equally at home in anything he undertook. And then it goes through his whole career. And at the end, it says, of late years, Mr. Benedict has been playing vaudeville. Lou Benedict was born in Kingston, Canada, December 6, 1839. So like Cool Burgess of Toronto, he was from the second wave of blackface minstrelsy, which begins in 1828, when a man by the name of Danny Rice formed the song Jump Jim. And that's where the names of laws came from. And the earliest I can find a blackface performance in Kingston was 1830, when someone from New York with the local regiment formed a song called which is a kind of song that would later be called coon songs. And here's Cool Burgess, which is the man is so hip that John Watson had to discuss him in class. He was, at the time, the most famous blackface minstrel in the world. He also played for King of England. He was always touring the United States. As you can see, he played in City Hall here in 1878, but he came here all the time. And the picture on the right-hand side, at the far right, is the picture that I found in that book I told you about, The Monarchs of Minstrelsy. So, Riley played with a white man in Canada. And he played with him and other in the United States. I wouldn't go back to the United States if I'd almost been sold on the river. But I suppose if he was in company with white men, he felt safe. These are men of mixed race, so they seem to be able to pass sometimes, and not sometimes, not some other times. You know what I'm saying? So this woman has an interesting story. This is Mary Harriet Cosby. She's the sister of the next guy that we jumped. This is her at age 98, I think. She's at this point living on Wolf Island, and I'll show you. Show you the story that I'm saying. This is from the 1950s. Fred Pence wrote this. The Pence family, as you know, owned the wig for a while. But by this time, I think the Davies were in charge of the wig standard. But here's an article about this woman. Active of mind and body is Miss Mary Harriet Cosby, Wolf Island, who will celebrate her 98th birthday on January 30th. Miss Cosby, a daughter of the late Charles Cosby of Kingston, was born in Kingston, but has spent the last 20 years residing with Mrs. Langham on Wolf Island. When I met this charming near centenarian on the motor ship Wolf Islander recently, I was amazed with the alertness of her mind. I enjoy the radio very much, she said, especially the news. When asked about the popular soap operas, she replied, yes, I must confess I listen, but I'm not fussy on the advertising which goes along with it. Speaking of Kingston, Miss Cosby remarked, I was born in the old limestone city, and I could look back for a long time. I knew Sir John MacDonald very well. I can recall one day when he called at my father's shoe shop on Wellington Street, suggested that he would like my father's support. My father, shoemaker, told Sir John that he didn't like his taste. Said Miss Cosby, you know my father was an expert shoemaker. Remember, not a cobbler. There is a great difference. The one makes shoes and the other repairs them. There are very few men today who make handmade shoes, which is what her father, Charles, could do. And then she says, many will recall my brother, the late Fred Cosby. And at that point, I realized Cosby was Crosby, who was a musician and played in orchestras. He was also a barber by trade, said the spry young old lady. Then, to the right of that, from 1851, I was looking up her history and her family's history, her father's history. I found that her grandfather was an even more remarkable man. His story is astonishing. Fountain Cosby dies in 1851 at age 90. At age 90. The genes in that family. But when I looked him up, another astonishing story. Cosby was born in the late 18th century in Maryland as a slave to a Spanish noble. The Spanish nobleman's daughter fell in love with Fountain and helped him escape along the Underground Railroad to one of its terminals, Kingston. And then she escaped. She went to him. Fred, the shoemaker, was Fred was one of the most popular musicians of his day. I'll show you some examples. So in 1888, we had Fred. We have Fred playing with a band called the Serenaders Club. Serenade. The Kingston Serenading Concert Company gave a concert in Hunt next Sydenham last evening. It was a very successful event. The residents of the village and surrounding country in attendance were highly pleased with the rich program presented. And I've highlighted his name. What did he play? Well, he played banjo. He could play violin as well. He was a dancer, and so you can see he performed a sad dance and a plantation shuffle. And he played with a guy. There's other people in here. For instance, the Thorntons. He plays with Thornton. He was a white man. Again, this is remarkable because the United States, they wouldn't allow this. Maybe they would in small towns where you just can't be that fussy, but certainly in major places, even northern states like New York. Blacks and whites did not play on the same stage at the same time. Sometimes there were impresarios who owned a black minstrel band and a white minstrel band. The whites would play first and then get off stage, and then the blacks would play. So they would share the stage at the same time, but he was sharing the stage with white men. I looked up the Thorntons. They're English. In fact, first Samuel Thornton, owned tavern hotel on Ontario Street called the Grand Union. Later on, one of these men, George Hammond, would buy the hotel. Why? Because sometimes blacks were denied to stay overnight. Here's an interesting. This shot here is interesting. The middle panel, it says a conservative smoker. They used to call them smokers because we smoked. These smokers, cigars, I guess, usually, and support Queens used to have smokers. They don't call them anymore because, again, smoking. It's not smoking. It's acceptability. But at this smoker, given at the McDonald's, Fred Cosby was playing. This small hall, Fraser's Hall, which is just, I'd say right next to, it was where Baron Peterson's docs in the alleyway. The small hall was fairly well filled with young and old conservatives. They were, considering their political inclination, pretty good-looking lot of fellows, too. I think the Whig by this time was liberal. The attendance, compared to that which the young liberals always count upon, showed to very poor advantage. Yet it was fair-sized and enthusiastic. Cigars and tobacco were supplied in abundance. And the same can be said of the members on the program. Thornton and Crosby's orchestra. Remember, Thornton also played with the previously named Kingston Serenade Club. Thornton and Crosby's orchestra supplied good music while songs were given by, and then there was a whole list. A violin solo by Mr. Crosby, as well as violin duo or duet by Messrs. Crosby and Taylor, were vigorously applauded, and not undeservedly. Clog dances were executed by Mr. Crosby and J. LaRush. The cakewalk, a cakewalk, by the way, was not an easy thing. A cakewalk traditionally was a slave dance, organized often by the masters of slaves. It was a prize for the ones who could best parody their masters. This was a cake. So cakewalk. The cakewalk, which had been resurrected in the 1890s, was done by Messrs. J. LaRush and F. Dunlop, and so that's one couple, Thomas Kelo and John Doyle. The latter was bewitchingly attired as a negress. So, again, female impersonation and blackface went hand in hand. The Pleasant Evenings program terminated at about 10:30 p.m. with the singing of the national anthem. Can you imagine conservative club nowadays performing blackface? I can actually, but not in drag. Apparently, it was very popular being dragged one time. And on the right-hand side, there's an advertisement from 1909 from the first Nickelodeon in town, the Wonderland. And it was reopened. It opened in 1907, in the spring of 1907, and then opened again in 1909 under new management. And this time, instead of just a piano player and a singer and maybe a drummer to do the sound effects, they had full orchestra. And it was Crosby and O'Connor's full orchestra. So Thornton's gone to the sea by, because in 1902, I saw an article in the Standard, or Wake, at the Daily British Wake, which accused him of being a wife beater. And by 1903, he was in the United States, performing at theaters in, let's say, Syracuse, and that's certainly upstate New York. Taking his place with Crosby, was a man named P.J. O'Connor. P.J. O'Connor was Irishman. He took up songs, Emerson. He was very young. He started singing in the local theaters at the Grand Theater, for instance. And he had another son, who's really good, who grew up to be Kingston's first television star. His name was I'll show you. As an entry in the Canadian Encyclopedia. Billy O'Connor, singer, pianist, songwriter, agent, born in Kingston in 1914. He was his father, Tommy, the guy I just told you about, who played with Crosby, was a pianist and entertainer who, during the late 1880s, worked in the USA with Lou Dockstedter's minstrels, and was an accompaniment to the magicians Blackstone and Thurston. Lou Dockstetter, by the way, was the man who gave Al Jolson his start in Blackface. Al Jolson was a Johnny-come-lately when it comes to this entertainment. By the time he did the jazz singer, Blackface minstrelsy was 100 years old. He was a revivalist, not an originator. So the younger O'Connor, was Billy, was taught to play piano by his father, and the family moved to Toronto in 1919 from Kingston. He served as an entertainment corporal in the Canadian Army during World War II and began working in Toronto nightclubs in 1947, and with broadcasts from the Club Norman, undertook a CBC career in 1948. O'Connor continued on CBC radio into the early 1960s and was also heard 1954 to 1959 nationally on a syndicated program sponsored by Coca-Cola, and in 1961 locally on Shawnee Radio. His CBC TV career began with Four for the Show, which led to the variety series The Billy O'Connor Show in 1954-1956, Club O'Connor 1957, and Saturday Date 1958-1959. His programs were noted for introducing new talent, including Peter Appleyard, Juliet, and the Two Tones, one of whom was Gordon Lightfoot. And that's him. That is Billy O'Connor. With some young ladies on the left, on the right-hand side is an advertisement, big standard, for his TV show on CKWS. How many seconds? I found this from 1949. It may surprise, from the Whig, as well as interest the present day tonsorial artists, that phrase that was not coined until the turn of the century, to hear that Kingston had two Negro barbers sometime before 1890. One was Clarence Jones, who had a son of the same name, and who had a shop in the Frontenac Hotel building on Ontario Street, and did a thriving business there. I don't recall that his son followed on his father's footsteps, but I do know that the youth about my age attended the Collegiate Institute when I did, and was a model young man, and noted especially as a fine piccolo player. The other colored barber was Fred Crosby, but he was better known as a superb banjo player and the best tap or clog dancer in the city. When the elder Jones died, his business died with him, as I recollect. What became of the son or of Fred Crosby, I do not know, for I left the city later. When I returned after some years, they were both gone. But I do know, and it is a credit to Kingston of that day, that no color line was drawn, and these three men were treated with courtesy and civility, and schools were open freely to them. Well, I'm going to tell you what questions. He was all right. According to an American newspaper, this was a black newspaper, published in Indianapolis, called the Indiana Freeman. This is a very important newspaper for scholars of black music in America. It had the best columns, most informative articles about the state of the industry. And this is an article about Kingston's Clarence Jones. Clarence P. Jones is a real Canuck from birth. Having first seen the light of day at Montreal, Canada, at an early age, his musical instincts cropped out, and his parents soon placed him under the tuition of one of the greatest pianists of his native home, under whose wing he remained for 5 years, during which he had also studied the more advanced branches of his chosen profession, such as harmony and thorough bass, etc. Afterwards, he took up the study of the flute, and has since been solo flute of the Philharmonic Society of Kingston, Canada, playing with Oscar Telemann, as well as a piccolo soloist of the 14th Battalion Band, the finest military musical organization in Canada. Mr. Jones was also flutist in the Grand Opera House Orchestra. What he means is the Martin's Opera House, because Grand Opera House didn't really begin until 1902. So I think from about 1890 to 1895, he was playing for Martin's Opera House. Mr. Jones, he played for the Grand Opera House, I'd say Martin's Opera House, which position he held to the satisfaction of everybody for a period of 5 years. Mr. Jones came to this country, he means the United States, in 1995, when he made his debut in the theatrical profession, joining L.G. Field's Darkest America company. This was an all-black company. As a piccolo and flute soloist, he gave the whole sidewalk to none. He is too far beyond the average competitors for consideration and comparison. Mr. Jones is very much at home on the instrument called the piano and executes in all branches on his various instruments. At sight. He is this season with John W. Fogle's Darkest America. Fogle bought it from the previous owner, where he can be both seen and heard and is a stone wall to that grand concert band of the age. The same paper gives an account of the formation of the Benevolent Order of Colored Professionals. Clarence P. Jones was one of the originators of the order and worked up interest in the scheme. He was elected chairman of the Supreme Advisory Board. So he wasn't just a musician. He was an organizer. By the way, the musicians of Kingston weren't organized until 1919. There was someone else who was an organizer. Daniel Riley, the first man I mentioned to you, as a barber, was on the executive. He and his steps were on the executive of the local chapter of the Knights of Labor, which did not discriminate on the basis of race or gender. This is a picture. So this is a picture. John Fogle's Darkest America, around 1898. So this would have been around the same time. But Clarence Jones was playing for them. And you'll notice that one of the performers is in blackface and the other is not. And now to the final man, George Hammond. This is his obituary in the Wake from 1917. Former well-known Kingstonian passed away in Edmonton. George Hammond, a former well-known resident of Kingston and at one time proprietor of the Princess Theatre at 261 Princess Road. Later, is dead in Edmonton. Mr. Hammond, his wife, who, by the way, was a Wolf Island girl, and his wife went west several years ago. Deceased was well known as a singer, having taken part in many concerts at Kingston and Dispute. For some years, he was also engaged in the marine business, operating a steamer between Kingston and Kingston Mills. In fact, he built that boat. He was 48 years old. The census says he was 38. 48 years old, born in Hamilton. The census says he was born in Cuba. A son of John Hammond, he was half-brother of Jack Cunningham of Beefsteak Jack's Restaurant. The late Mr. Hammond was an excellent swimmer, and some years ago, during his residence in the city, he saved the lives of several children, 6 or 7. He was awarded a medal by the Ontario Humane Society and was presented to him by the late E.J.B. Pence at Princess Theatre before a crowded audience. Hammond was, by this time, the manager of that theatre and a mariner. He was no longer just George Hammond, he was Captain George Hammond. And he ran a cruise ship from Newfoundland to Kingston Mills. He also ran the mail from Kingston. On the left-hand side, the most famous. This is 1903. It's George Walker, his wife, his Ada, and in Blackface. Williams. W.C. Fields called Burt Williams the funniest man I've ever seen in the saddest man in the neighborhood. Some say it had to do with the fact that maybe he felt that he was degrading himself. But I've also read him with his own words, and he was quite different. He wasn't concerned about the intellectuals or ministers who would believe for him to take off. Well, as I mentioned before, he also owned a hotel so that black folks could stay overnight, guaranteed. And this is just an advertisement from 1907 when he first became the singer of the first movie theater in Kingston, Fin-de-Siecle Theater. Yeah, the Wonderland is right next. Well, you know, the Grand Theater is at 218. Wonderland was at 220. Sorry, at 220 was a confectionery shop owned by the South. And this is an advertisement from Edmonton, which is what it does. He, by this time, was working for the Allen brothers. The Allens were the first movie lobbyists in Canada, one of the largest theater chain in the world, until they were crushed by Adolf Zucker. Wanted to buy them out. They refused. So he just refused to let them play his movies. So what was the capital? It was the first Dueck theater from 1820 to 1823. These men were successful, I think, despite the odds. And yes, it is nice to see that Kingston tolerated them. But the KKK was in town at a certain point. When in 1915, the Birth of a Nation opened here, it opened to rapturous praise. School children are encouraged to see it as history. They could buy tickets to see it from their school teachers. And 10 years later, the KKK marched down Princess Street and held a rally in City Hall. In 1926, they were invited to take part in the Dominion Day Parade along with Girl Scouts, church groups, and the Great War Veterans Association, Blackface Minstrel. These men succeeded despite the racial endeavor, not because we were extra tolerant, but it could be that Kingston was just small enough that it couldn't be that openly racist. Perhaps not a coincidence that most of them end up living in the United States. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gordon. Listening to that, you've done a wonderful job of recovering this history, both in the archival sense. But, one of the sad things about any kind of history like this is that the music is gone. We can't hear any of this music.
That's really good. I just wasn't able to put it into the show. I found on YouTube some songs that are from the end of homie, like the show that Hammond and Johnson Fox. I was thinking though, since I couldn't do it here, I could send you guys the link.
Yes.
You could put it on a website.
Yes.
You could listen to wonderful music.
Yeah. Yes.
Let me begin with one question.
Why barbers? Why did these men, three of the four, become barbers? It seems to me that, by observation, that black hair is, of course, different than white hair. When I've been in the Caribbean, there is a segregation, white barbers, black barbers, but how were they accepted? Because it's a very intimate process having your hair done.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the first black businessman,
First black businessman in Kingston was a barber named William Johnson. His son, James, was Sir John MacDonald's barber. I think what happened was, just as Chinese men were shunted towards laundry, perhaps in restaurants, black men were shunted towards this sort of care carrying position, you know what I'm saying? Almost like women's wear. But also there's, you know, even going back to Europe, there was a long-standing tradition of barbershops and music. And it's barbershop quartets weren't invented in the 1950s. They were invented around the same time as ragtime. And in fact, George Hammond was a member of a barbershop quartet. He was the only one who wasn't a barber. There were a barbershop quartet in Kingston called the Twilight Harmony 4. So I think that's the part of this presentation that I wish I could expand on, but I guess for now I'll just say that there is a tradition of barbershops being social places for men to gather, and it used to be that men would sing as well at these barbershops. White men in Europe and often black men in North America.
Come to think of it, of course, the railway porters were largely black. You know, very good novel a year ago called The Railway Porter, which delved into this. Other questions, please.
You're right about the barber shops. I remember there was a barber shop in Little Burgundy in Montreal, right across from Rockhead's Paradise. That was a focal point for a lot of black musicians. In Montreal,
Montreal, yeah.
Little Burgundy.
Yes, little, exactly.
Yeah, Oscar. Yeah. I dated a girl once that lived right across the street. It's true, I dated a girl. It was back in the 80s. That was the one I concluded. The other thing I wanted to mention too, it's funny you mentioned that one of the fellows had bought a hotel because he could stay in the hotel. A dear friend of mine is Abraham Bolden, who was JFK's first African-American Secret Service agent. And when he traveled with JFK, President Kennedy, to Florida, he could not stay. Here's a man tasked with keeping the president safe. He could not stay in the same hotel as President Kennedy. And that's a true story. That was 1962. So talk about it. Now I find myself in the embarrassing situation where I know far more about the civil rights movement in the United States. I have no idea what happened here. And it's embarrassing. It truly is. Basic question. Any idea if black people were allowed to vote? Was that province by province, section by section, or was it?
Not only were they allowed to vote.
Not only will they allowed to vote,
Gordon. The camera. Yeah, problem.
not only were black men here allowed to vote, not only were they allowed to vote, they could run for office. However, it wasn't easy. George Mink, who was who was a businessman here, he ran a livery service. He was well respected. He was a former slave who had been freed, and he was encouraged to run for city alderman. And then someone spread the rumor that it was just a joke, and then he removed his name from the list. Yeah, but by the way, speaking of the civil rights movement, I've been looking through the history of blackface in Kingston since this era, and what happened here happened in the States as well, or vice versa. The civil rights movement had an impact on blackface. Suddenly it became less respectable. And so here, I think it was in just a month after Martin Luther King was assassinated, there was a high school in town, Rivendell, I think, that was putting on a blackface minstrel show. But because of the assassination of that man, they decided to go on with the show, same songs, Old Black Joe and Swanee River and all that stuff. But they wore clown costumes instead of blackface. I don't know. But look, in Britain, you had the black and white minstrel show from 1958 to 1978. And they experimented once there was blowback with other costumes. It didn't work. But yes, it lasted as long as till 1978. And I still know people who say, you know, it was harmless fun. Well, that's not what the black community there thought, and that's not what the black community thought here either. And like I said before, as early as 1840, the blacks of Toronto were petitioning the city council to take this stuff off the stage. So not everyone was comfortable with this form of entertainment. But if you were a black entertainer, you didn't really have much choice, right? It's the 1960s as well, where Black Power emerges and it's like, hey, we're not going to be your clowns anymore.
Yes, when you reflect on our recent history, not think of the politicians who have been found in their high school annual yearbooks, including our prime minister. And this is just off the charts now. It shows how times have changed.
Yes.
Any other questions? Anyone in Zoom land?
I don't know. I just know that we've had a West Indian or Caribbean community for quite a while. They're not, I don't know how many of them there are, but they have their own church. So there is a core to it. So,
Jennifer, you have a question, please?
Thank you. I was interested in the first person you spoke of who came from the county Antrim in Northern Ireland. How many blacks do you think there were at that time in Ireland? That surprised you?
it surprised me. But, you know, when I found out that she was West Indian, I figured, well, you know, this is the transatlantic slave trade. And you know, Britain was part of that. Canada was part of it. The United States was part of it. Along the way, it wouldn't be surprising there would be some black people in parts of the UK, or in the case of Ireland, the not quite United Kingdom. So, I mean, I was surprised. And you know, but not as surprised as Daniel Riley was when he was told he was a slave. I mean, he must have spoke with an accent. And here's this white man telling him, I'm taking you to Mississippi. No way. Yeah.
I have a question.
Mike,
All through the civil rights movement in the United States, Jews and blacks work together. I think of the movie Mississippi Burning, Schwimmer, I forget the other two fellows that were killed. And was that mirrored somewhat in Canada? Was that mirrored somewhat locally? Anyone else?
Well, the
Mike,
got the link here. Here it is.
yeah, helicopter.
In terms of civil rights, I haven't really figured that out. But Jews and blacks and Greeks worked together in the early 20th century they were the foundation of our theater district. New immigrants like Jews who would often start off, and Greeks who start off as confectioners, would perhaps convert their store or buy a storefront and convert it to the 5-cent theater. And then George Hammond would come along and sing for them. And there were other singers as well. But what I'm suggesting here is that it was these newcomers and people have been, you know, Hammond was, you know, he'd only gotten here in 1902, but the black community was here as long as they were here, came here along with the United Empire Loyalists. They were the slaves of the Loyalists. So the connection between the new immigrants and the blacks, Kingston, there was a connection, early connection, not necessarily, you know, that the Jews were fighting for their rights, but basically giving them the right to perform. Because they, you know, why bother excluding them? I had something to add to that. It'll come to me. But so I don't know much about the civil rights movement in this city, but I'm still cobbling it together. so far, I'm basically mostly up to 1930. Like, basically, my course that I'm teaching, what involves this material, goes from 1830 to 1930. I'm hoping to create part 2 soon, and I'm hoping that this course that I'm teaching will become a book. It'll be like the first century of entertainment in Kingston. I'm actually a little surprised. I've asked you guys, why isn't, all I did was look at the downtown music scene from a century or so, 2 centuries ago, and I just discovered an entire new cast of characters, to put it, that way, and an entirely different, like a new industry, a new economy that no one's ever studied. Everyone remembers the Capitol Theater. Some people remember the Tivoli, but what happened before? I mean, the material that I have discovered about the first Nickelodeons, like the Wonderland and others, Princess and the Bijou, even that stuff that is inaccurate. Like, there's no historian who's really dug into it, and I'm glad, because that gives me an opportunity to do it. On the other hand, it'd be easier if there was some other material, because this is all primary research.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Listening to you, I think of what has happened in hockey in Canada in the last decade, where there has been a discovery of Black players and a celebration of them, in fact, and maybe that's on your horizon.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that. As you know, the first hockey game in Kingston was played between RMC and Queens in 1886. I found a report. Turns out the women outnumbered the men. Why? Well, it turns out half the cadets were on the other side of town at a minstrel show at the lunatic asylum. The lunatic asylum held shows all the time. They said it was therapeutic. So the patients would be the orchestra, and the performers, the comedians and singers, would be their keepers, and sometimes their doctors. So Cheryl Thompson was the only person who's written about the Canadian history of blackface, has said that blackface minstrelsy is as Canadian as hockey, and my research shows indeed it was. In fact, that for a long time it was more popular than hockey.
One other thing that occurred to me, am I right in saying that all 4 of your gentlemen were mixed race?
Yes.
This is delicate, of course. Were they more acceptable? Was this osmosis into white culture or white audience easier because they were mixed race? What if they had been pure Black?
No, that's a good question. So I'll give you an example. I went through the census to see how they were describing the census. So Crosby/Crosby. Remember, he is the descendant, the grandson of an escaped slave by the name of Fountain Cosby. When they first appear, when Fountain's son, Charles, that is the father of Fred, is mentioned in the census, he's listed as mulatto. And then the second time he's mentioned, he's described as Spanish. George Hammond was described as Spanish as racial origin, even though when he was arrested in 1906 for selling candy on a Sunday, because it was the Lord's Day, he was described as Negro. But in the census, he's Spanish. So,
and that's because they're darker complexion.
Yeah. So depending on the circumstances, they were passed for white, or they were definitely labeled as Black.
The more sinister their action, the darker they got.
Yes. And I suppose the more successful they became, the whiter.
Peter.
Thanks, Duncan. Peter Garth. Thank you very much for that. I just want to go back to that question about why barbershops. And I think we're forgetting the social importance of barbershops. I lived in the rural part of Bray County, where my barber had been, well, he was about 80 or 90 years old, and he remembered back to the Second World War, when Saturday evening, the barber shop was where every male went. You had to get cleaned up before you went to church on Sunday. And it was in such an important place. Our local MP was Agnes McPhail, the first female MP, and she would go and talk and do her politicking in there. And it really, I don't doubt if there were that many musicians there, but here I can see that that is where the musicians would start. There's a good audience. They're not going to leave. They're going to wait. There's a long lineup anyway. So I think barbershops had a much more social importance than we think of them now.
Oh, absolutely. And I would add that, obviously there were white barbers here as well, and including men who in 1919 organized barbershops, sorry, not a barbershop, a music union, musicians union. I don't think it's a coincidence that it was barbers who had already organized their own that profession, were also the ones who organized these musicians in town. They went on strike a couple times.
Musicians union? Any idea if they were allowed in the musicians union?
Were they allowed in the musicians union?
That's a very good question, because by the time musicians union comes about, Hammond is in Edmonton, or dead actually. Jones is living in Tampa Bay. I think this is also the time when these guys just left. Now, why? I don't know. Maybe it's just being a pastor somewhere else. Maybe the community was too small for them here. I know that one of them had a brother, George, who was a black man who organized, was the musical director for Blackface minstrel shows here in Kingston. He moved to Nova Scotia, to Halifax, joining the musical movement there. He married a Halifax girl and was, the choir master for their black church. So I think some of them just, maybe the community here was too small, and the more they travel around the world, maybe they had more choice.
I know my wife and I have written about black music in Bermuda, where there was a kind of sub calypso culture. The most famous group was a group called the Talbot Brothers, all black, not Blackface, all black. And they had sensational success in the tourist industry, and then went to America, appeared on Ed Sullivan, the college circuit, etc. But the American Musicians Union would only let blacks in as an associate member at a lower rate of pay, etc., even though they had a bigger draw on many audiences. So there was, as you say, segregation in the States.
Yeah, Gompers of the American Federation of Labor, right?
Yeah.
He was quite open about that it was for whites only, and the local musicians union was affiliated with the AFL. Yeah.
There was also, and this is harder to document, a fear of the black musicians on a sexual ground. They were seen as black musicians. And with the Talbot brothers, young American co-eds who came were just fawned over them. And I can see that the union and whites in general found this threatening, although not expressing it in any overt way. So,
yeah. And then upstate New York, believe it or not, around 1900, the soldiers, the black regiment, were known popularly as the Buffalo Soldiers, of whom Bob Marley sang. They were stationed at Oswego, and they even they had a baseball team and they challenged the Kingston Plays, but unfortunately there was a smallpox epidemic that had gotten away in 1908. But they organized a dance. The girls went, and the men at the time nuts, and accusing them of being rapists.
you're doing some very instructive evening, and You know, we Canadians tend to fall into kind of comforting racial stereotypes. You reinforce some of those today. These musicians were better received here than they probably would have been in Syracuse. But you've also shown us the complexity and also the shadows they live in. And so good luck with your book. Bring them out of the shadows. And on behalf of the society, thank you very much.
Next time. Appreciate it. Thank you so much for being here and just.
I'll say good night and thank you to everyone here and in Zoom land. And again, as Paul said at the beginning, we look forward to seeing you on Sunday, the 18th of February in that beautiful City Hall in the Memorial Room to hear Dr. McHenry talk about her new book on 20th century Canadian architecture in Kingston. And we'll be serving tea that afternoon. So we look forward to seeing you. And our next lecture meeting comes in March when we talk about railway development in Kingston. That's at the website. So thank you again. Good night.